For 600 years, Europeans ate the dead. Not in famine, not in war, in their finest pharmacies, ground into a fine brown powder, bottled, labeled, and sold by the spoonful. And the bodies they were eating came from Egypt. They were eating mummies. Kings did it. Doctors prescribed it. The wealthy paid fortunes for it. For 6 centuries, the most advanced medicine in Europe was powdered Egyptian corpse. And here's the part that should keep you watching. That is the least strange thing about this story. Because to understand why a pharaoh ended up in a London medicine cabinet, you have to understand what these people did to their dead in the first place. And what they did was build the most sophisticated death ritual the world has ever seen. A 70-day process. Priests wearing the masks of gods. A hooked iron rod pushed up through the nose to pull the brain out, piece by piece. They threw the brain away. They thought it was useless. But the heart? The heart they left inside, because they believed the heart could think, the heart could remember, and one day the heart would have to testify. This is the story of how an entire civilization declared war on death itself, how they almost won, and the question no one ever asks, what if we had never found them? What if every mummy had crumbled to dust before we learned to read them? How much of what we know about ourselves would simply not exist? This is What If We Never Discovered Egyptian Mummification. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why the Egyptians may have achieved immortality after all. Just not the kind they were hoping for. To the ancient Egyptians, death was not the end. It was a doorway. But the doorway only worked if the body survived. They believed every human being was made of more than flesh. There was the Ka, your life force, the Ba, your personality, your soul, and the Ak, the version of you that would live forever in the afterlife. When you died, these pieces scattered, and every night your soul had to find its way back home, back to your body. But if your body was gone, if it had rotted away into nothing, your soul would return to find no door at all, and you would be lost forever. This is why they fought so hard to preserve the dead. It wasn't sentiment, it wasn't fear. It was a rescue mission, carried out across eternity. So how do you stop a body from decaying 3,000 years before refrigeration? You outthink rot itself. It began in the desert. The very first Egyptian mummies were accidents, bodies buried in the hot sand, and the sand did something miraculous. It pulled every drop of moisture out of them, and they simply didn't decay. The Egyptians noticed, and then they spent the next 2,000 years trying to do it on purpose. The process they perfected took 70 days. First, the priests, because this was never surgery. It was theology made physical. The man cutting the body open wore the mask of Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead. In that moment, he was the god. He took a blade of obsidian, volcanic glass, sharper than any metal, and opened the left side of the body. Out came the stomach, the liver, the lungs, the intestines. Each one washed, wrapped, and sealed inside its own sacred jar. But not the heart. Never the heart. And then came the strangest step of all. They took a long, hooked rod of iron, and they pushed it up through the nostril, breaking through the thin bone behind the nose into the skull. And they pulled the brain out, through the nose. Sometimes the tool broke. We know this because archaeologists have found the rods still lodged inside the skulls 2,500 years later. They didn't preserve the brain. They didn't even keep it. To the Egyptians, the brain was just stuffing, useless. They were certain that thinking, feeling, being, all of it happened in the heart. And in a strange way, they were about to be proven right, just not how they imagined. Once the body was empty, the real work began. They covered it and filled it with natron, a natural salt from the dried lake beds of Egypt. And for 40 days, the body simply waited. The salt drew out every last trace of water. The thing that rot feeds on was gone. When the priests returned, the body had changed. It had lost more than half its weight. The skin had turned to leather, stiff, dark, permanent. It looked exactly like the mummies we recognize today. And here's what almost no one realizes. That iconic mummy face, the hollow cheeks, the leathery skin, the timeless stillness, that isn't what time did to them. That's what the embalmers did to them. On purpose. In 70 days. They didn't just slow down decay, they defeated it. Then came the wrapping. Hundreds upon hundreds of yards of linen, wound around every finger, every limb, layer after layer. And hidden between those layers, they placed amulets, tiny charms of protection, the eye of Horus to guard against evil, a scarab over the heart to keep it pure, a small amulet at the neck, believed to magically stop the head from ever being removed. Every wrap was a prayer, every layer a spell. And the materials they used to do this tell us something staggering. When scientists analyzed the residues inside an ancient embalming workshop, they found ingredients that did not come from Egypt. They found resins from forests thousands of miles away, substances traded all the way from Southeast Asia. To preserve a single body, the Egyptians reached across the entire known world. Think about what that means. The pursuit of eternal life built one of the first global trade networks in human history. Death was driving the economy of the living. But not every mummy went according to plan. Take the most famous one of all, Tutankhamun, the boy king. When his body was examined, something was wrong. He was damaged, burned. The leading theory? The embalming oils poured over his body reacted with the oxygen in the sealed tomb and the linen wrappings. And the boy king's body slowly caught fire inside his own coffin. He was trying to live forever. Instead, in the dark, sealed away from the world, he quietly burned. So now, let's ask the question this entire video is built on. What if it had all been lost? What if the tombs had been emptied and burned before we ever learned to study them? What if every mummy had crumbled to dust and we were left with nothing but stone and legend? What would we actually lose? The answer is far bigger than you think, because a mummy is not just a body. A mummy is a sealed message sent forward 3,000 years, waiting to be opened. Inside those preserved bodies is the DNA of the ancient world, the actual genetic code of people who lived before recorded history. From mummies, we have pulled the traces of diseases that haunted humanity for millennia: tuberculosis, malaria, smallpox, ancient strains of bacteria and viruses frozen in time that teach us how disease itself evolves. Modern medicine, studying the dead to protect the living. The Egyptians thought they were preserving souls. They were actually preserving evidence. But it goes deeper still. Without the mummies, we would lose the people themselves. We know what they ate. We know the diseases they survived and the ones that killed them. We know they suffered from arthritis, from infections, from the same aching human frailty we feel today. We can reconstruct their faces. We can look into the eyes of someone who walked the earth before the pyramids were old. Without mummification, all of that vanishes. An entire civilization reduced to guesswork. And here is the cruelest irony of all. For centuries, we almost did destroy them. Remember how this story began? Europeans grinding mummies into medicine and swallowing them? That really happened. For 600 years, countless mummies, priceless, irreplaceable, were dug up, crushed, and eaten. It gets worse. Mummies were burned as fuel. The writer Mark Twain claimed they were thrown into furnaces to power Egyptian trains. They were ground up to make brown paint for European artists. There are paintings hanging in museums right now, colored with the bodies of the dead. We came within a breath of erasing the greatest record of the ancient world by treating it as medicine, as fuel, as paint. The Egyptians built their bodies to survive 10,000 years. They never imagined the threat would not be time. It would be us. So let's return to where we started. A pharaoh in a pharmacy. A king ground into powder, swallowed as medicine by people who had no idea what they were destroying. It sounds like the ultimate defeat, the ultimate insult. But step back. Look at the whole story. The Egyptians had one goal, a single, burning obsession that consumed 2,000 years and an entire civilization. They wanted to defeat death. They wanted to live forever. And here is the truth no one tells you. They succeeded. Not in the way they dreamed. There was no afterlife waiting in the field of reeds. The soul did not return to the body each night. But the body remained. 3,000 years later, they are still here. In our museums, in our laboratories, on our screens, right now, in this very video. We speak their names out loud. Tutankhamun, Ramesses, names that should have vanished 30 centuries ago. A civilization is truly dead only when the last person stops speaking its name. And by that measure, the Egyptians never died at all. They wanted to be remembered forever, and against every odd, across 3,000 years, through grave robbers, through fire, through being eaten as medicine, they are. The brain they threw away. The heart they thought would let them speak in the afterlife. But it was neither. It was the body itself, the thing they fought so hard to keep, that became their voice. A message in flesh and linen that finally reached us, and that we, at last, learned to read. They didn't find eternal life. They found something stranger. They became immortal, in the memory of a species that wouldn't even exist for thousands of years after they were gone. The ancient Egyptians asked one question: how do we live forever? And the answer was you. The fact that you know their names, the fact that you are thinking about them right now, that is the afterlife they were actually building. And it worked. I'm still thinking about that hooked rod, pushed up through the nose, the brain thrown away as worthless. They were so sure it didn't matter. And yet, here we are, using ours to remember them. This was Iron Epoch. Some empires are remembered for how they lived. The Egyptians are remembered for how they refused to die. If this story changed how you see them, you know what to do. The doorway stays open, as long as someone keeps walking through it.